Ketogenic diet, a high-fat, low-carbohydrate approach.
Brain is a very energy-needy organ. People with Alzheimer's disease, these areas of the brain take up ketones normally. Ketones can provide this fuel for our brains. Fatty acids they're larger molecules. They don't cross easily into the brain.
The brain is a fascinating organ. It uses a lot of energy.
Cells are basically starving, malfunctioning because they don't have fuel to work to break down proteins in your muscle to make there's certain amino acids that are converted to glucose. Coconut oil has 60% medium chain triglyceride. If you fasted for 24 or 48 hours once a year, that it may reduce your risk of getting cancer.
In each episode, we dwell into the realms of wellness, exploring the latest trends, expert advice, and practical tips to help lead you a happy, healthier life. We aim to bring a broader perspective to our American audience on issues that impact your daily life by interviewing guests from the US and around the world. From nutrition and fitness to mental well-being and beyond, we're here to empower you with knowledge and inspiration. So whether you're looking to boost your energy, revamp your diet, or simply trying to find a balance in your lifestyle, you're at the right place. Join us as we embark on a journey towards a better, brighter you. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan, and together let's unlock the secrets to living life to its fullest. Ketogenic diet, a high-fat, low-carbohydrate approach, has extensively studied for its neuroprotective properties. By shifting the body's fuel source from glucose to ketones, this diet may enhance brain energy, reduce oxidative stress, lower the inflammation, affect the metabolism, and then support mitochondrial function, key factors in maintaining cognitive, healthy brain. Research suggests that ketones can serve as an efficient alternative fuel for the brain, improving neuronal function, stabilizing the brain networks, and potentially benefiting individuals with neurodegenerative conditions, but especially Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and perhaps even epilepsy. Welcome to another episode of Khan Klinics. I'm your host, Dr. Amir Khan. We have a very special guest today. Our guest is a physician, author, an international speaker, known for her pioneering work on ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, particularly in relation to Alzheimer's disease. She graduated from Xavier University, Cincinnati, Ohio. She also did her medicine from University of Cincinnati College and practiced neonatology for over 30 years. Her interests in ketones emerged from personal experience, her husband's diagnosis of early-onset Alzheimer's. Dr. Mary Newport has authored several influential books on ketogenic nutrition, including Alzheimer's disease, What If There Was a Cure? We have a third edition out there, and one of her latest books, which is available on the shelves for healthy brain aging and Alzheimer's prevention. Dr. Newport, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Khan. I really appreciate the invitation.
Let's explore the world of ketones with Dr. Newport. And we want to be looking at the impact and what our audience especially is interested in effects in Alzheimer's. You've mentioned the role of glucose metabolism in Alzheimer's and the benefits of ketones. Explain to our audience, Dr. Newport, in simple terms, how ketones help brain cells and ways glucose cannot, and especially then in context of Alzheimer patients.
Okay, so one of the fundamental problems in Alzheimer's disease is that there's a problem of getting glucose into the brain and then into brain cells, specifically into neurons and probably into other types of brain cells. And it's in very specific areas of the brain in Alzheimer's. In Parkinson's disease, it's in another part of the brain. Different types of dementias begin in other, various parts of the brain. There's this a problem with getting glucose into the brain and into brain cells, and then some enzyme deficiencies that are involved in this, and glucose transporters are decreased. It's almost like there's a conspiracy of getting glucose into the brain, and it's something that it's relatively slowly evolving. For most people, it actually starts with the aging process, that there is a deficiency of how much energy the brain gets compared to how much it really needs. And this is pretty apparent already for people that are in their 70s. Even people who test normal cognitively, there's a deficit of brain energy. Dr. Stephen Cunnane has done a lot of research in Canada using ketone and glucose PET scans, studying adults of all ages. He has studied well over 300 people. And what he's found, that compared to young, healthy adults, that people who are in their 70s, for example, that are cognitively normal, have a deficit of brain energy that's about 7 to 9%. And if you have mild cognitive impairment, that increases to more than 10%. With Alzheimer's at the earliest stages, it's a 20% deficit. That means your brain is getting that much less energy to actually function on. And the brain is a very energy needy organ. It's about 2 or 3% of our body weight, but it uses about 25% of our calories. The brain's very active. Even during sleep, it's extremely active, and it needs a lot of energy to function. People may start noticing this in their 70s, don't process thoughts as quickly. They don't pull memories out of their brain, names and other things, as quickly as they used to. And that probably reflects this deficit in brain energy. And also, the brain is shrinking a little bit each year. And this tends to progress more quickly in some people than others, especially if there's inflammation in the brain. So the neat thing about ketones is that they can pick up the slack. They can provide energy to these areas of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's. And Dr. Cunnane's been able to prove this, to show this, that people with Alzheimer's disease, these areas of the brain take up ketones normally. And, basically, most people tend to eat a higher carbohydrate diet, relatively lower in fat, and they don't have a level of ketones in their blood most of the time. If they fast after 10 or 12 hours, you'll start to break down some fat, and some of the fat's converted to ketones in the liver. So if you do an overnight fast, say for 12 or 14 hours, in the morning, you'll have some ketones in your blood. And as long as you keep fasting, the levels will get higher. During starvation, the levels get very high. This was shown in the 1960s, that when people are in prolonged starvation or prolonged fasting, that the ketone levels start to increase. After maybe 24 to 36 hours, they become very detectable, but then they continue to rise for another 10 days or so, and then they start to level off at a very high level of ketones. And basically, the glucose level in the blood tends to drop, but it's still there. There are other ways of producing glucose besides getting glucose in the body. And so, ketones can provide this fuel for our brains. Like, say, our ancestors, they used to have periods of feast and famine. They would have time, a week or so sometimes, when they couldn't find food to eat, say in the winter, and, store fat when they had plentiful food and burn the fat when they didn't. And, so most of our organs can use fatty acids as fuel. The heart, the kidneys, all the muscles can use fatty acids, but these fatty acids they're larger molecules. They don't cross easily into the brain. And so fat is taken in the liver and converted to ketones, which are much tinier molecules. They're actually a little smaller than glucose. They easily cross into the brain, and brain cells can immediately switch over from using glucose to ketones to make energy, which is ATP, basically.
Follow-up question: why is it essential that the brain needs ketones, and it has some protective effect in Alzheimer's? versus the regular sugar that can cross or get to the brain. Now, brain is a fascinating organ.
Yeah,
It uses a
yeah,
lot of energy. It needs a lot of energy
right.
to function. And
Yeah,
in fact, one of the highest demanding or consuming organ in the body in terms of the glucose and oxidation and stuff. Why is it that there is an extra interest in saying ketones are protective?
yeah.
And especially we talk about Alzheimer's. And then you just mentioned, there is a surge of ketones. Could you explain that part, Dr. Newport?
Yeah. So, basically in Alzheimer's, there's a problem with insulin resistance. To understand what that is, people who have type 2 diabetes have insulin resistance. So basically, over time, the pancreas puts out insulin. Insulin's required to get glucose into the brain and into brain cells. Either directly or indirectly, insulin is required. Basically, glucose can't enter the brain cells.
Excellent.
These certain areas
Excellent.
of the brain can't enter the brain
Excellent.
cells. They can be swimming in glucose, but glucose can't get in because
Beautiful.
they're resistant to insulin. I've seen some research where there usually are insulin receptors on the edges of the cell membrane that allow, that
Glucose to be
glucose
transported
attaches
across.
to, and then it transports it across. But they have seen that these insulin receptors have pulled away from the cell membrane, like in a globule within the cell itself. They're not on the surface where they need to be to let glucose in. So this was some really interesting research. I saw this around 2010. So literally glucose can't get in even if the cell's
Beautiful.
swimming in glucose. So the cells are basically starving. They're malfunctioning because they don't have fuel to work with to keep them going, and they just don't have access to it. These cells, there are many cell membranes insulin receptors on a cell membrane, and they just become diminished, fewer, and then finally, I guess some cells may have no insulin receptors or minimal insulin receptors. So slowly evolving process.
So, because there's now, Dr. Newport, there's not enough glucose for the brain to function, the neurons begin to die as a result. And especially there is an effect on the mitochondria, and that is now inefficient. For layman terms, I say it's inefficient and it's not functioning as it should do. As a
Exactly.
result, there is degeneration, and hence Alzheimer's, people with aging and who need those neurons built, who need that surge, perhaps even more when
Yeah.
you're older, are now on the cusp of being more deficient. Would that be
Right.
a fair explanation?
Yeah, that's a good explanation. Yeah, neurons, it's thought that they can live as long as 120 years. That's why they think that the maximum lifespan for humans is probably around 120 years. There are a few people that have been documented that have lived a little past that. But the neurons, we think, Dr. Kunane, we've talked about this a lot, but he believes that many neurons just kind of go dormant. They lack energy, and they're like cars that don't have gasoline in the tank. It might be a perfectly good car, but it can't run because it doesn't have fuel. And this is very literally fuel that needs to be able to get into the cell and into mitochondria. And there's a series of chemical reactions that happen that produce ATP, this energy molecule. And glucose and ketones can both enter this very same
Pathways.
chemical, series of chemical reactions. Fatty acids can too, to generate this ATP. But like we were saying, most people don't have a level of ketones. If they're eating a high carbohydrate diet, say you get up in the middle of the night, you eat something, your body doesn't have a chance to use up the stores of glucose in your body and switch over to burning fat as fuel. We have enough glucose. We store some glucose mainly in our liver and in the muscles, and that can be completely depleted after about 24 or 36 hours. And in the liver, it's about 10 or 12 hours or so, that the stores of glucose are depleted. So then the alternatives are, for example, you can break down proteins in your muscle to make, there's certain amino acids that are converted to glucose. So that's one way to do that, but that's not a great way to create fuel because it weakens the muscles. If you break them down too much, they become atrophied, they weaken. And this is what happens, for example, when somebody is starving for a long time, they can live, well, if we didn't have fat, we would use up our muscle,
Sure.
burn it up very quickly within 7 to 10 days and die, even if we had water. But since we have fat, a human who has access to water could live, it's documented a month, even 2 months,
Mhm.
potentially based on how much fat they have until there is no fat. And then they would start burning muscle and then they would pass away. So it's a very interesting idea that I basically came across in 2008 to try to help my husband.
I wanted to go to that part of this and hear
Yeah.
from you your story. But before I go, Dr. Newport, just from the previous discussion we had, and
Mhm.
you just mentioned that the ketone levels during starvation, you mentioned fasting, and you
Right.
mentioned that there is a surge and ketones go up and then they
Correct.
plateau off. If I was to ask, there is in Christianity, in Islam, in other religions, there's a fasting month. Would the ketone surge at that time have a protective effect in the long term? Do you think, even though it's transient, it goes up, it comes down? It's probably in Christianity, but 40 days,
Hmm.
Islam 30 days, and
Hmm.
perhaps in other
Hmm.
religions,
Hmm.
less, Buddhism, perhaps even more. Do you think that has any protective effect? Does that
Oh, I
have
do
any
think
bearing?
so.
Just,
I
just
do think so. Yeah, there have been studies of fasting, and Dr. Mark Matson, he was with the NIH for many years. I think he's at a university now, but he was studying this. He has put out a couple of papers where he discusses metabolic flexibility. So he talks about overnight fasting and exercise mainly, but has quite a few studies that he discusses in this article showing the benefits to cognitive health and aging, slowing down the aging process, through fasting. And one thing that happens, Dr. Tom Seyfried, he studied ketogenic diet for cancer extensively. And he, feels that when you fast, it kind of resets your mitochondria. It
interesting.
helps them function normally again. He has said in presentations that he believes that if you fasted for 24 or 48 hours once a year, that it may reduce your risk of getting cancer because the mitochondria become very abnormal in cancer cells. They start fermenting glucose instead of processing it through normally in the mitochondria. It's a very interesting idea. It's been really around since the 1930s, but he started really studying this, and he believes that the mitochondria could be reset and potentially you'd be able to get rid of, so to speak, mitochondria that aren't functioning normally. So there are many benefits, but there are many studies, showing that fasting is beneficial to brain health and overall health.
Thank you for explaining that. There's a fascinating personal story you mentioned in your book,
Hmm.
and we were all very intrigued by how your husband, who I understand was an accountant, helping in your career
Hmm.
throughout, and then there you started noticing he had Alzheimer's, a slow progression, but by 2006, and he was still in his 50s, young age, there was a
Right.
rapid deterioration.
Yeah, very rapid.
Along the course, you mention in your book how you've tried certain therapies, certain
Hmm.
diets,
Hmm. Hmm.
and we're going to be discussing some of them. Some helped,
Hmm.
and but some didn't. But eventually, we had that big setback.
Hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that, and then we can pick up from how it helped you explore more into the keto world, and how do you think then it was beneficial. So, love to hear from you.
Yeah. As you said, by 2006, he had been an accountant for my medical practice. He was able to work from home. I was hospital based, and
Mm.
he worked from home and he was available for our children. So it was just an ideal setup for us. Made it possible for me to be a doctor and a mother, I'm still so grateful for.
Sure.
But he began having problems with his accounting that became very noticeable. He would procrastinate getting tax reports done, and then he started forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And he was just in his early 50s. He was 51 at this point. And I thought that didn't seem normal. And he was also very depressed. And looking back, we believed he was depressed because he knew what he had been able to do and that he wasn't functioning as well, that something was wrong. He
True.
knew that maybe 2 or 3 years before I did. But so we fast forward to 2006, and now he's deteriorated so much that he can't even turn on a computer, much less use a mouse or use a calculator or do any simple math. So everything deteriorated. He was on a computer all day, and now he can't even turn it on. He had to stop driving. He could hardly finish a sentence. He would forget what he was talking about mid-sentence, and that happened frequently. And so he was about to try out for 2 clinical trials. There were 2 new drugs. We finally had clinical trials available in our area that gave us hope that this might be a drug that would help him survive and maybe improve. And I was reading about these two drugs that he was going to try out for, and he was scheduled 2 days in a row, which was very fortunate because we ended up having testing the day before and the day of that he started taking coconut oil. And so I was looking for these 2 drugs and more information about them, and I came upon a press release about a medical food that was going to come out about a year later. And it was, they said that it improved the memory and cognition of nearly half the people with Alzheimer's that took it. So first they did a pilot study with 1 dose. Even with 1 dose, half the people improved. They got like a placebo one day, and they got this medical food the other day, and half of them improved with the medical food. And then they studied 152 people for months, and half of them improved, and they sustained their improvement, And so they didn't say what it was, and I was able to get their patent application, and I found out that it was MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil. And I was familiar with this because of the work that I did. I was a newborn intensive care specialist, and we used to add MCT oil to the feedings of our tiniest preemies. And then they started adding it to premature infant formulas. And even today, if you look on the labels, you'll see medium chain triglycerides in premature formulas and in formulas for babies that have trouble tolerating feedings. And then I learned from the patent application that MCT oil is extracted from coconut oil. And coconut oil has been used also since the 1980s in infant formulas to provide these very important fatty acids that are in breast milk called medium chain triglycerides, and which these MCTs, like, for example, one of them is lauric acid, which is highly antimicrobial. It's known to help protect the newborn against infection. This is half of the fat in coconut oil. So I was kind of fascinated as I was reading this patent application, and they talked about this problem of insulin resistance in the brain and brain energy, and that ketones could theoretically improve somebody with Alzheimer's by providing ketones. So I thought, okay, this sounds reasonable. And I remembered some of these facts about ketones and starvation, from medical school. And so he was scheduled, I was reading this around 1 a.m. in the morning, and he was scheduled at 9 a.m. for the first testing for the clinical trial. So I didn't have time to do anything, to buy coconut oil or anything else. And so he went for the screening, and he needed to get 16 out of 30 points on a test called the mini mental status exam, test of cognition. And he got only 14 points, and he didn't qualify. And we were devastated. We were really devastated. And the doctor asked him to draw a clock, and I'm going to try to show this to you. It's in the book.
Yes, ma'am.
This is supposed to be a clock.
Wow.
Yeah, and you can see it's just a few little random circles and numbers, very disorganized. Yes, and the doctor told me that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's, which I kind of sensed, but this was very disturbing. And so on the way home, I thought I had seen coconut oil in health food stores. So we stopped at one and we bought some coconut oil. Yeah. And then when we got home, I found the fatty acid composition of coconut oil. I thought, I'm going to try to give him an amount that would equal a medical food, that the dose they had used in their studies. And so I was able to calculate coconut oil has 60% medium chain triglycerides. And I thought I could figure out, and I worked out that if I gave him 35 grams, which is a little over 2 tablespoons, that would be equivalent to the amount of medium chain triglycerides in the medical food. The dose was 20 grams, which is about 4 teaspoons. And they used a very specific medium chain triglyceride. I was counting all of them, but anyway, so the next day I measured out a little over 2 tablespoons, put it in some oatmeal. Coconut oil is a little kind of semi-solid at room temperature, so did that to make it, enjoyable for him. And he ate it, and then he was tested at a different center for a different drug, different town, different day of the week. And this time he gained 4 points on the test. He remembered what town we were in, which was different, what day of the week it was, which was different. He remembered the season that he couldn't remember the day before, and which floor he was on in the institution. He remembered that. And he gained 4 points and he qualified for the study.
Wow.
Yeah. So we weren't sure at first. Was it good luck? Was it prayers? Was it this
Could be
coconut oil that had
Sure.
helped him?
So were you
So,
giving that
well,
regularly at that time? Then you started to give him
yes,
coconut once a day, 2 tablespoons as a routine.
as
For
a
how
routine
long?
every morning. But I started the next day giving it to him at other meals.
With meals
And I'll
as
tell
well.
you why. I did that because when I read this application, the patent application, when they tested the people after taking MCT oil, their ketones peaked at about 90 minutes and they were back to baseline to where they started at 3 hours. And I thought, well, your brain needs fuel 24 hours a day. What about the other 21 hours? So I thought, why not give it to him since it's a food, give him a little bit at each meal. So I gave him always, in the beginning, a little over 2 tablespoons for breakfast, but then other times of the day I would cook with it, would put it in a lot of foods, warm foods, like we would put it on a sweet potato or something like that. And just each meal. And what we saw was each day he got better and better. Before we started doing this, he was very lethargic in the morning.
Sure.
He barely talkative. He had a hard time walking. He walked very stiffly.
Sure.
He couldn't run anymore. And he basically told me he felt like a light switch came on in his brain the day he started coconut oil. And his spirits lifted, his depression lifted. He was very depressed at that point. And his depression lifted, he felt like he might have a life again, that he might improve, that there was hope for his future, basically. And then at 2 weeks, so 14 days after, he drew another clock. I'll try to show that.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's see. Can you see it?
Yes. Wow. It's huge
Yeah.
difference.
So you can see. Yeah.
Huge
Huge difference.
difference.
There's a whole circle.
Yeah.
The
And-
numbers are all there. I think there's a couple
Yeah.
extra numbers and a whole bunch of lines. I thought they were hands of the clock, but he told me he was trying to line the numbers up across from each other.
Yes. Yes.
So
Absolutely.
I thought,
It's in the
okay,
book.
that's very interesting.
It's in the book, and you mentioned
and
that. And
then
that's after just 2 weeks of therapy,
that was
and
2 weeks.
just 2 weeks of therapy, and his mini mental
Mhm.
score improved from 14 to 18 at least, and then you were seeing a
Right.
steady improvement. And then how
Right.
long did this last for? Were you seeing, because you were now giving him lots of coconut oil. It wasn't just the 2
Yeah.
tablespoons. You were giving
Yeah.
probably 10
Yeah. It
table.
kept increasing. I
Yeah,
kept
10,
increasing it.
12.
And and I had made contact in the meantime with Dr. Richard Veach, who was a world expert on ketones. He was at the NIH his whole career, and he was working on a ketone ester, which can get ketone levels much higher. He'd been working on it since the 1990s, and it hadn't undergone toxicity testing yet, and he hadn't been able to get funding to do a trial for Alzheimer's yet. But he became very interested in this, and he encouraged me to give him more MCT oil. So I started adding that as well. And slowly, the thing about these oils, it's a good idea to start very slowly, like a half teaspoon or a teaspoon. We got very lucky that he was fine with 2 tablespoons.
Right, right.
But some people, how to put it politely,
Not going to
you
tolerate
can
it.
develop diarrhea. Diarrhea is a common
Diarrhea,
problem. If
yes,
you
ma'am. Very
too
severe
much
diarrhea
too
start.
fast on the stomach,
Yes.
yeah. So I generally tell people to start with like a half or 1 teaspoon 2 or 3
Half a
times a
teaspoon.
day, and to take it with food. Yeah, it works better if you take it with food. It's digested better. It doesn't kind of run through you, I guess.
Excellent.
You could think of it that
It's
way.
good advice.
Yeah, but we did that. So we added MCT slowly, and he worked up to quite a bit. He was probably taking 10 or 11 tablespoons a day of the combination, either coconut oil or coconut and MCT oil, within a few months. And some of the other interesting things along the way, we just saw steady improvement. His conversation improved very quickly, started whistling and joking. When people have Alzheimer's, they often look like they have like a dead or kind of sleepy look, not very animated. And the animation in his face came back very quickly.
Wow.
He had tremors that went away. But at 2 months, he could tie his shoes again. He hadn't been able to tie his shoes, and he could tie his shoes. His gait had improved so much that he was walking normally and he could run again. And then at about 3.5 months, he told me, one day he said, "I can read again." And I said, well, why couldn't you read? He hadn't been able to read for about 1.5 years. And he said, when he looked at the page, he described it as satellite breakup. On your TV, he said the words would break up into, he called them pixels, and move around on the page when he was trying to read. And that had stopped after about 3.5 months. And then he could read again. And he did start
Profound.
reading again. It was really fascinating. And I took videos of him periodically. I would have him read an article about Warren Buffett. I would have him read the same article just to see. And he could read this. It was really very interesting. And he would, I would have the video showing him tying his shoes and walking, just to show his normal gait. But he, it was really quite dramatic. And then Dr. Veach, his toxicity testing was completed. And he, after like 2 years after we started the coconut oil, Steve became the first person with Alzheimer's to take Dr. Veach's ketone ester. And it bumped his ketone levels up quite a bit higher. You can easily get 10 times higher ketone levels with this one dose of this ketone ester. Like within 30 minutes, your level will go quite high. And Steve improved more at that time. He had kind of a setback, and everything that had deteriorated came back very quickly. And then he was stable for another 20 months before he had a problem. So altogether, to the long story of answering your question, it was about 4.5 years, almost 4 years, I want to say, that he was better than he had been the year before we started this, for almost 4 years. And then, sadly, what happened, he had a terrible seizure one day. He was standing, he fell back, straight back, hit his head, and he went into a prolonged seizure that lasted about 20 minutes. And I was at the hospital. There was a lady with him. And when I got home, I got there before the ambulance did. He was still blue. She said he hadn't been breathing. She was trying to keep him breathing. And so he suffered a really serious, lack of oxygen to his brain. And he didn't recover from that. He didn't recover. And, it kept giving him the ketones. He lived another 2.5 years. We didn't expect him to live that long, but he did. But he was very dependent. He needed a lot of help after that.
After the seizure. Do you think, would you be at that time measuring his ketone levels or his blood ketone, triglycerides, lipid, or anything? So that's question number one. When you're saying, or we saying, you're giving extra ketone salts to patients, and you want to see an improvement, what are the things you should look for besides the diarrhea? And you mentioned that you should do a steady increase. But would there be any blood tests you would recommend to see if there is an improvement or not? Because this is just, we have to remember, just a one person, one patient story. It's not like FDA approved for Alzheimer's and for Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah, it's FDA approved for general use.
General use.
Yeah, and it was FDA approved for athletes to improve athletic performance. It was that approval came along first, and then they did toxicity studies in adults from ages 20 to 70, and for 28 days they took large doses of it, and there were I think there were over 2,000 doses given, and there were 6 side effects. Only 6 episodes of side effects, and it was mostly like an upset stomach. I think 1 or 2 people had diarrhea, but it was mostly very well tolerated. It doesn't taste good. It's actually out on the market since 2018. It's available that people can just buy it. What I understand from the people that sell it is that about 70% of the people are using it for fitness, for athletic fitness. The Tour de France, a lot of the bicyclists were using this ketone ester the very same one that my husband took.
But that's
And
for extra energy, you would imagine. That's for body
Yeah,
fuel, supplement that because they're fat deprived. They need that extra sugar. They need that extra energy, not
right.
for
Because they're
brain
burning
therapy
fuel
purpose.
very quickly. They're burning fuel very quickly. And it helps keep them sharper, cognitively speaking, too, apparently.
But is
They
there an
initially it
indication?
was,
Is the
Mhm,
ma'am,
go ahead.
Dr. Newport, an indication for brain specific therapy?
Mhm. So the original, when Dr. Beach began studying this, his first grants were from the Department of Defense in the U.S. And they were trying to develop something that the troops could easily take out on the field. They couldn't carry a lot of food, with them, but they would be out for long periods of time. And the ketone ester was originally funded. The studies that were funded were to look for cognitive and enhancement of cognitive and physical performance because they did believe that it could enhance cognitive performance. And there have been a number of studies now of MCT oil, specifically a couple of coconut oil, showing that they did see cognitive improvement in people that had memory impairment, for example, or Alzheimer's, even mild Alzheimer's disease. There have been several, I believe somewhere around 12 or 15 studies now, mostly like small to medium sized studies showing that they do see cognitive improvement. It supports with the medical food, what they found, back in 2008. So it's very interesting, the whole idea. A lot of apparently the people in the Olympics were using it too, to try to enhance their performance. And it's a naturally occurring molecule. That's how they can get away with it. They could be on a ketogenic diet. Well, a lot of them are. They do a ketogenic diet, and then they might take a dose of the ketone ester before they either work out or before they are in a contest, so to speak. So its uses are very wide because of what it is. It's a fuel. It's a very primitive, basic fuel.
So, would you also explain to our audience, people listening who loved ones elderly, especially
Mhm,
have Alzheimer's now,
mhm,
what would you advise those patients about? A, we know there is no treatment as such for Alzheimer's, except
mhm,
for the couple of medicines that have come out for early Alzheimer's.
mhm.
Lilly has one that's come out, the Casonala, which is the Nopamab, and which is an infusion, but that's also shown in studies that it halts the progression to about 20 to 25%. But that's only indicated in early Alzheimer's. Message
Right.
for those whose loved ones already have Alzheimer's and are not
Yeah.
early and advanced or intermediate advanced and not able to
Yeah. Yeah.
look after. What
Yeah.
would you
Well,
advise?
I would advise them, to try to include some, begin adding some like coconut oil, maybe start with coconut oil and maybe some MCT oil. But the other thing too is that this insulin resistance problem, lowering the carbohydrates in the diet, eating a higher quality diet can really help potentially slow it down as well. There's like an expert panel. There's a Lancet committee that they publish every couple of years. Basically, they study lifestyle and Alzheimer's disease. And for a while, they were saying 30% of Alzheimer's might be preventable by making lifestyle changes. They upped it to 40%, and their latest, they say 50% of Alzheimer's might be preventable through lifestyle changes. I think even if, it's a very slow process, I don't think it's really too late at any point to try to do something to intervene. Maybe at the very, very last stages, you might not want to, but I think Steve, my husband, there's 7 stages of Alzheimer's. He was between stage 5 and 6 out of 7 when we
Mm,
started this, and he improved. He went back a couple notches, as far as stages. He didn't completely get better, but he was functioning much better again, able to do so much more and talk more fluently. And socially, a lot of people didn't realize that he had Alzheimer's. I think that well into the disease that there are things you can do. And their number one lifestyle change is eating a healthy diet. And, there's so many ultra processed foods around, quick and easy foods to eat, fast foods they have a lot of chemicals. We don't recognize the names of them when we look at the labels. And I'm a really big proponent, and well, really the Lancet Commission too, what they define as a healthy diet is eating a whole food diet, whole food, getting away from these ultra processed foods, so we're talking and eating more vegetables, eating more fruit. And with a ketogenic diet, with a low carb diet, berries are low in carbohydrates. So berries are good. Blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, apricots are low in carbohydrates. There's certain fruits that, are low, but emphasizing vegetables more, eating a really well-balanced diet, eat whole grains. If you eat grains, eat whole grains. Don't eat like white bread, white rice, that have white flour. They've removed like a lot of the fibers taken out of those, and a lot of the vitamins disappear, the naturally occurring vitamins, and then they fortify it with synthetic vitamins that don't work as well as the kind of vitamins, the forms of them that you get from food. So, I usually will recommend to people that they try to cut the portions of carbohydrates they're eating. A lot of people, they don't want to completely give up bread or rice and pasta, but I suggest, well, why don't you cut your serving in half? Start there. And, like a lot of people in the US, they'll have a plate that they load with pasta. It's covered with spaghetti, and then they put a little bit of meat, the sauce on the top of it. Cut your portion in half, and then when you're used to that, cut it in half again. And it's Dr. Kuhn just recently completed a project. I think it's going to be published soon, but it was in an assisted living facility, and it was elderly people, and they ate their usual breakfast, but then they had them cut the carbohydrates in half for lunch and dinner, the portions. They were able to reduce the glucose in their blood by 40%. 40%. And, so your pancreas doesn't have to work as hard, it helps improve insulin sensitivity to do that. And, potentially even in the brain, it can improve insulin, how sensitive your cells are to insulin. So by eating a lower carbohydrate diet, it might, prevent or slow down decline. I think that's kind of where we're headed. And, another thing too is exercise. Most people, if they're physically able, can take a walk. And when you walk for 30 minutes, for example, it increases your ketone levels, and they'll stay elevated for 8 or 9 hours, unless you eat a lot of carbohydrate right before you take your walk. So if you either don't eat or eat a low carb diet, and you take a walk, it can stimulate ketone production. It's similar to fasting. The article I told you about with metabolic flexibility, he discussed a lot of studies. There were very similar results for fasting and exercise.
Sure.
In these types of studies showing, benefits to cognition and aging. And so those are two of the big ones. Controlling blood pressure is very important. Controlling blood sugar is very important as far as slowing down cognitive decline.
Appreciate that. Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Newport. I know we're running out of time, but before, just a couple of last questions. One would be about, you mentioned the keto diet, but not the carnivorous diet. You don't advocate or de-advocate that because you think it is good.
I don't think people need to go that far. Some people do a carnivore diet and they're almost religious about it when they do. It just, when you think about it, humans can survive on a carnivore diet or a totally vegan diet. Sure. No intersection between these two. One's all animal foods and the other's all plant foods, and food. Humans are capable of surviving on these. But I think most people are going to have a difficult time doing a purely carnivore diet. I mean, if you can, that's great, but I don't think it's necessary to do that. And there's certain vitamins that are in vegetables that are not so much in animal foods, and vice versa. Vegetables don't contain vitamin B12, very important to brain health, and but animal foods do contain vitamin B12. So there are considerations like that, and that's where I kind of think a balance in the types of foods that you eat is a good idea.
Balanced diet.
But it's portion control. I mean, I've visited Japan, for example. They have very tiny portions of a lot of different little foods, and their reputation is they eat a lot of rice. Well, they have a small amount of rice, from what I observed. They may have a small, like a half cup of rice. In the U.S., we might pile it up on the plate. It could be a cup or cup and a half of rice. Just think about reducing the portions of those kind of foods.
A measured
just
portion.
kind of, yeah, and
That is what you.
it doesn't have to be all coconut oil either. Olive oil is a good fat. Butter is actually a very good, a lot. Butter and lard got a very bad reputation, but a lot of this was related to the food industry as they were marketing shortenings and margarines as replacements for lard and butter.
Yeah.
A lot of the beliefs that people have about lard and butter really stem from market competition for products.
I agree.
Yeah,
Well,
it's very sad.
We want to remind our audience that olive oil, butter, dairy products have definitely have a definite important role, especially in the keto world, and what's been going on. So we appreciate that, Dr. Newport. I want to thank you for your valuable insight.
You're
Your
welcome.
brilliant, your brilliant talk, basically bringing in a lot of experience. And one final message, would you like to give to those families, especially who are like myself, dealing with someone who has dementia at home, and basically there is no hope?
Yeah, a lot of doctors say go home and have a good life, get your affairs in order, but I do believe that there are things you can do to actively try to slow it down, with diet, and maybe include, I've had many, many people, we talked briefly before the recording, but, I have collected emails from, hundreds of people since this started in 2008. And I got to present a study at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference in July of 2023 in Amsterdam. It was a peer-reviewed poster presentation, 288 people who had reported to me while they were taking coconut or MCT oil. And I think people are more likely to report to me if they had a positive outcome, but 90% of them reported some kind of improvement. And, in some cases, in many cases, 2/3 of them reported some kind of cognitive improvement, memory, or they were brighter, they were clearer, they did better on test scores, things like that. But many people reported improvements in depression and anxiety. Their mood improved. They were less angry. They recognized their children or family members again. They were interacting socially more. They were more talkative. They were completing sentences better. Some of them had physical symptoms like my husband, tremors and problems like that went away. Sleeping better, eating better, various types of things that people have reported. And, so I think it's worth a try. It's a food. It's not a harmful drug that has a lot of side effects. And I think it's worth at least trying to do that. And then I think you can, make it even more maybe effective by reducing the carbohydrates in the diet and trying to eat whole grains instead of white flour, things made with white flour and white rice. Just get a nice, well-balanced diet.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, that's all the time we have for today, Dr. Newport and everyone. Huge thank you to you, Dr. Newport, for sharing your knowledge, experience. It's truly been an enlightening session. And thank you for coming on board and sharing this with us. And to our amazing audience, thank you for tuning in for another episode of Khan Klinics. If you have enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. But more importantly, we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to put in your comments. Wish you good luck and have a good evening. Goodbye to everyone.